Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Democratic Constitution podcast. I'm really excited today to be talking once again with Gil Schaeffer. Gil's written several articles for the Democratic Constitution blog, including Marxism Is Democratic Republicanism, the history of the struggle for equal human and political rights from the inside out, and the Democratic Constitution strategy is the blueprint for a new party. That means voting for Democrats in 2024, even Biden. Gil also played a very large role in creating a new reader that we posted on the blog called Recovering the Struggle for Equal Rights and Democracy. And Gil's also written a long work on Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, which is available on his website. And I'll link that in the show notes. And I wanted to have you on today, Gil, to talk about an article that you wrote for Marxist Unity Group's blog outlet called Light and Air. And that article is titled The Legacy of the Civil Rights Movement. And we republished that article on the blog. So first off, Gil, thanks for coming on again.
Great to be here.
So I thought we could begin with your political background leading up to your move in Oakland in 1970 to join the Revolutionary Union, the RU, which is something that you discuss in greater detail in your article about SDS, which I mentioned. It's called You Can't Use Weatherman to Show Which Way the Wind Blew. But if you could just introduce us to your life, your political development leading up to 1970 and your move to Oakland.
Sure. Well, I entered college in the fall of 1967 without real familiarity with any kind of radical politics. Okay, so just freshman in college, but there were lots of things going on. Right, the Vietnam War was raging. In the summer of '67, there were the massive riots in Detroit and Newark. And there was kind of the enveloping framework of the Cold War, and the atomic bomb, the threat of nuclear war, which in the Cuban Missile Crisis was very real. So all of that was in the atmosphere. Okay, so I get to college, and across the hall in the dorm were two sophomore members of SDS. And so we just quickly started talking about primarily the Vietnam War, but everything else under the sun. And so from that point on, I was just immediately involved in SDS and all the political questions that were going on. And then so very quickly, 1968, just an extraordinary year. The Tet Offensive, Martin Luther King's assassination, the president withdraws, decides not to run again. Bobby Kennedy's assassinated. The police riot at the Democratic National Convention. So that was 1968. Just incredible upheaval. And so the ideas in SDS are just rapidly developing. And that's when SDS really then starts re-examining the whole history of Marxism, and now primarily because of the Vietnam War, but also beginning familiarity with the Chinese Revolution. And it's an interesting intellectual problem on the development of the New Left, because with C. Wright Mill's letter to the New Left, he makes this statement. Where he talks about how Marxism was connected to a labor metaphysic, okay, and that the working class is the prime agency. So he disagreed with that. This is in 1959, and he's talking to British Marxists. But after he criticizes the labor metaphysic and traditional Marxism, he says, forget Victorian Marxism, but read Lenin and Luxemburg again. Now, that's an unexplained, not understandable comment he made that the New Left didn't know what to do with. And yet, events forced the New Left back into the study of Marxism, anti-imperialism, and the Chinese interpretation of that in terms of, anti-colonial struggle. Okay, so that's the dynamic that happens very quickly. And so in 1969, at the summer convention, the Revolutionary Union publishes what's called Red Papers, in which it adopts basically the Chinese Communist Party outlook on the world, and says that's the direction the New Left should go. After you leave the campus, go to the working class. And as Max Elbaum says in his book, that production by the Revolutionary Union basically set the framework of discussion in what became the new communist movement for the next 5 years. Now, I happened to, through a friend in college, I knew people who were in the RU in 1968, before all this happened. And so I had both this personal connection, even though my political understanding was not particularly great, because I, still really young. Had that personal connection, but I knew what was going on, and when Red Papers appeared, I knew who had produced it. So that's the precursor to, after the invasion of Cambodia and the National Student Strike, of moving to Oakland and joining the RU.
You mentioned in your article that there was a critique of the RU made by the Communist League, the CL, and that they critiqued the RU for what you call the RU's hesitancy to put Marxist-Leninist propaganda and party building at the center of its political work. Can you talk a little bit about the critique that was being leveled at the RU and perhaps how they reacted to that?
So in the beginning, when Bob Avakian and Steve Hamilton moved to Richmond, a working class community, just north of Berkeley, in late 67 and early 68, at that point, they were revolutionaries, in the sense of they sold the Black Panther Party newspaper. They wore Mao pins. They talked about the Red Book. On their jobs, in plants in the area, which generated, a lot of arguments and fights, but also an acceptance. I mean, it's not that, everyone they were working with disagreed with what they said. But the problem is, once you say it, we need a revolution. It's like, okay, how do you get it? Right? And so there's this, kind of initial high where you lay out what you really believe. And you even get some people to agree with you, but then where do you go from there? And so they ran into that problem early on. And by 1969, they were then trying to deal more with what Mao called the mass line. Like, well, where are people at? And how do you develop a movement? How do you make it grow? Okay. And so the RU came up with this idea that they would promote what they called anti-imperialist ideas, but not communist ideas. And they would appeal to kind of the average worker. And so on all kinds of issues, the Vietnam War, racism, police repression, economic issues, they would denounce that stuff, but they wouldn't connect it yet in their publications. The RU created a number of monthly newspapers, and they wouldn't connect it yet to revolution or communism or Marxism, Leninism. Now, initially, in SDS, Mike Klonsky was the head of another faction, and he early on criticized the RU for that, saying they were doing Popular Front stuff and that the primary task was to form a party. Now, Klonsky was not consistent in that and changed his mind. But by 1972, this other group, the Communist League, which was a small group in LA headed by Nelson Peary, African-American, former member of the Communist Party, had his own group of mainly Black and Mexican workers, and he was a consistent Stalinist. And so, very small group, but they were the ones who criticized the RU for being economistic and for not following, advancing Lenin's theory of political consciousness. And CL became significant because they made ties with certain people in the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit, which the RU was also working with, okay? And that's what created the political tension in 72, 73, 74. And so it was an argument about what is the obligation of Marxists and revolutionaries to raise consciousness, and how do you do it, and what's the content of it. So that was the setting.
One of the interesting things is that there's a variety of opinions around what it means to, I think, build consciousness. So you write that you thought the RU was neglecting Lenin's theory of political consciousness and leadership, and you continue that you meant by political consciousness and leadership Lenin's theory of democratic egalitarianism. So how did you approach this question of Lenin's theory of political consciousness? How was this different than maybe most other folks were thinking about it?
Like I said, the RU had begun these monthly newspapers. Okay, now they weren't much. Okay, there was just like in the Bay Area, there were 3 different newspapers in San Francisco, in the East Bay, in Oakland, Richmond, and one in San Jose. And it was a mechanism that Bob Avakian came up with, because the RU was very small up until the invasion of Cambodia. There were really just several dozen people in the Bay Area. So the invasion of Cambodia happens. There's a national student strike. The draft laws are changed. The draft goes down. And all of a sudden, there are several thousand radical students who decide to make this move into working class jobs to do some kind of Marxist activity. And so there's this influx of people, and so the RU has to say, well, what are we going to do with this? They're young, inexperienced. What do we do? Well, let's put them to work making a newspaper. and you can write it, produce it, sell it on the streets. It gave new recruits something to do. By 1972 or 73, there were about 20 of these newspapers across the country in different cities. And the RU is the biggest Marxist-Leninist organization to grow out of the New Left. So I'm working on the newspaper, and then George Jackson gets killed in San Quentin prison in August of 1971. And then soon after that, there's the Attica uprising in New York, and the takeover of the prison. And so it turns out I'm supposed to write an article about the meaning of George Jackson's life and death, and what does it mean to the working class struggle. Okay, so I was having difficulty putting the two together. What does it mean to the working class, but mainly the white working class, right? That's what it's supposed to mean. I mean, that was the problem. What's the relationship between the black liberation struggle and the white working class? I mean, how does it go together? So I'm having trouble writing this article, and one of the head of the paper, the RU head of the paper, says, "Why don't you read Lenin's article, The Drafting of 183 Students into the Army, and get an idea?" Okay, and I said, okay. So I read it, and it's about a student strike in Russia in 1901. And Lenin uses to expose how the Tsar represses freedom of speech and freedom of study. But at the end of it, he says, if the workers don't come out to support the students, they have no right to call themselves socialists, which was the exact opposite of what was going on in the New Left, where, the students were supposed to go join the working class. And here's Lenin telling the workers, no, you have to go join the students. Now, in fact, something like that did happen with Avakian and the RU in Richmond. In early 1969, there was a strike at the Standard Oil refinery over a new contract. And at the same time, there's a strike going on at San Francisco State University for a Black Studies department. Well, the RU is in both situations, but both places. And the strikers from San Francisco State actually joined the picket lines in Richmond to support the oil workers. So there actually was this kind of interchange going on. But the main thing about the article is that Lenin argues that socialism, and by socialism he means the whole body of thought of Marxism, socialism means opposition to all oppression of any kind. And in chapter 3 of What is to be Done, section E, he has the subsection is titled The Working Class as the Vanguard Fighter for Democracy. And he means by democracy both equal rights against all oppression, but also the establishment of a democratic republic. So that was my introduction to Lenin's theory of consciousness. And I read it and I went, I didn't know really that that's what Lenin and Marxism was. And so from there, I then go on and start reading Lenin's collected works. First, volumes 2, 4, and 5, the political articles in there, which end with What is to be Done, where he develops his whole theory of democratic political consciousness, is the expression of socialism. And so my interpretation of what consciousness is democratic consciousness leads to socialism. It's not consciousness of socialism as an economic and political system. That there's the intervening movement is for democracy. And so I have that conception in my mind, which I'm trying to work with in the RU. At the same time, this critique from CL from another direction, from the Stalinist direction of a single party state, dictatorship of the proletariat, all the normal stuff. And so I'm also critiquing the RU from within for being economistic and not promoting these democratic ideas explicitly. And at the same time, CL is critiquing the RU from the outside for being economistic because it's not Stalinist. And that was the situation. The kind of the ideological stuff that was going on in 72 and 73 in the new communist movement.
What makes me think at various times I've described my own experience of reading the Socialist Party of America's 1912 program and being struck by their critique of the undemocratic apparatuses of the U.S. state, the Supreme Court, the executive, the Senate, so on and so forth. And having a similar thought of, I didn't know this was what socialists were concerned about. I thought this was all sort of extra stuff around bourgeois democracy and the superstructure of the state, which is secondary to the foundation of the economy, and so on and so forth. So it was those democratic demands, especially around the structure of the state, that introduced me to a whole section of socialism that I hadn't been taught or hadn't yet found. So I find that interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, the French Revolution just so dominated 19th century thought among socialist workers and whatever. And Marx and Engels grew up in that, and they adopted it. I mean, again, as you read back in, Marx and Engels were democratic Republicans. They demanded a democratic republic wherever they went. That is what they were politically known for. They were the political socialists. And it's no accident that the second international parties were called the social democratic parties. It's a combination of democracy and socialism, which of course changed with the Bolshevik Revolution. But again, the Marxist Unity Group goes into that second international history and does emphasize the democratic republican nature of classical Marxism. So it's there. It's what you make of it.
I wanted to ask where Martin Luther King Jr. fits into this discussion. You mentioned in your article that you started reading King, I believe, a little later than some of these other folks you mentioned. I'm assuming King wasn't a part of your RU education. Actually don't know how much it would have been a part, or he would have been a part of your SDS education. But all that to say, how does MLK and his thought fit into your political outlook?
Yeah, well, I didn't read King much. I go to college in 67 and he's killed in 68. I mean, now, what I was aware of course, of his role in the civil rights movement, his speeches, and then his speech in 1967, where he comes out against the Vietnam War and separates himself from other civil rights leaders. And his speech is powerful condemnation of American imperialism and militarism. Okay, but it's one of these ironic things where King's assassination makes people go in the opposite direction of what he was advocating. Now, I didn't know it at the time. King was a civil rights leader, and he opposed the Vietnam War, and he was killed for it. That was the end of it for me at that time. So the issue of Black liberation and its relationship to Marxism, in my experience, went through the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and the Black Workers Congress, because the Revolutionary Union and the Black Workers Congress and the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization, they were in discussions for a year and a half about joint work and attempting to create a multiracial revolutionary working class movement. Okay, so that was the context that Black liberation, my association with the Black liberation movement. It was only a couple of years ago that I actually started reading, King's works. And again, he had an argument, with the Stokely Carmichael in 1966 about Black power. But again, it was, I was vaguely aware of that argument, but not intimately and not politically. And so King argued at the time that Carmichael's notion of Black power was a dead end, and that King advocated a multiracial democracy, which he called a colorless democracy. And he also argued that Black people would have to lead the struggle for democratic rights, and that struggle for their own liberation to become equal members of a democratic society would also transform the entire society to the benefit of, let's just say, the disadvantaged in general. So just recently, and in the article that I wrote on the legacy of the civil rights movement, I connect in my mind, King's notion of the oppressed for their own liberation being the vanguard of everyone else's liberation. And I connected precisely to Lenin's conception of the working class as the vanguard fighter for democracy. And so that's the conceptual framework. Now, there was the time in the early 70s where the League of Revolutionary Black Workers had a slogan called "Black Workers Take the Lead," and they had disagreements with the Republic of New Africa people, with the idea of Black liberation as some kind of separation, and different from the Panthers' notion of community control. They had a notion of a unified working class movement for democracy, freedom, liberation, socialism. All of those ideas weren't precisely defined, but they had it in their heads of being a vanguard of a multiracial working class movement. And then how do the different organizations work together. So there's SDS, the New Left, which was primarily white students. There's the Black Liberation Movement. There's the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization. There's Chicano organizations, the Native American organizations. Could they come together in some kind of unified project? So that was what the RU, the Puerto Rican Workers, and Black Workers Congress were attempting to do. There were also Asian American groups. That's what they're attempting to do. And while they're having these political discussions, it just as a random accident, there's this major strike in Texas by Mexican American workers against the Farrah Clothing Company, which becomes a nationwide boycott, which both the AFL-CIO and the RU promote. And it became an example of what was possible, of how what might be termed, some kind of separate struggle of a particular nationality or ethnicity, because of its working class character, could become general and universal and supported by everybody. And that was probably the high point of the discussions of unity before they fell apart, which we can get into. But those were the kinds of discussions going on.
You've touched on this a little bit, but certainly the relationship between the Black liberation struggles and the white working class, to frame those two things in that particular way, is still an ongoing question. For example, within the DSA, there's an awareness that the DSA is largely a white organization. Questions of how does DSA relate to movements like Black Lives Matter, abolitionist movements, anti-police violence movements, and just the larger diverse working class. There's also, I think, remaining questions around, I know, remaining questions around decolonization, what that means, colonialism, so on and so forth. One encounters all of these elements within DSA, I'd imagine, in most other left spaces as well. And people have their reading groups and study sessions around decolonialism and anti-police brutality and prison liberation and prison abolition, so on and so forth. How do you put these things together? It sounds like through this lens of the struggle for democracy, but was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit.
First of all, it's never been a problem for me, in the sense that I have never accepted the characterization of white being a determining category in the struggle for democracy. I mean, there are whites for democracy, which of course King pointed out. Hey, look, whites got killed in the civil rights movement. So what is this nonsense? Whiteness, certainly has a meaning, but to me, it had a meaning outside of the struggle for equality. And there's also this conception that it begins with Marx, I think. I mean, I don't know, but it's certainly prominent in Marxism, that where Marx stands outside the historical and political process and makes these grand observations. Okay, well, okay. But my experience, with the draft, with the Vietnam War, with the lack of democracy in the United States, with the threat of, nuclear war, we're not outside. We're inside. We're in it. Now there are degrees of obviously degrees of oppression and denial of rights, and how much leeway do you have in your life? I mean, sure, there's all that, but it's there is also a commonality against injustice of all kinds. I mean, I just happened to listen to Bob Dylan's "Masters of War," and where he has this line of the fear to bring children into the world. Okay, well, I mean, that was just a common feeling, and it's oppressive, it's inhuman, and so there is a commonality of interest of all kinds of people against imperialism and the undemocratic U.S. political system. And so to me, it's a matter of finding the way to bring that commonality together, and that's what democracy represents. And so, whatever this thing, whites are not outside the movement, and we have to find some way, to build unity. Anyways, that's just a general thing that, again, some of these concepts just get in the way of clear thinking, and just create, false paradoxes that are not helpful at all.
How would you describe the legacy of the civil rights movement, the title of your article, if there was something that you'd encourage folks to take away from it these days, a way to conceptualize it, either in terms of achievements, non-achievements, a second reconstruction, as some people call it, and the need for a third, as other people say, missed opportunities. How would you describe the legacy?
Well, I think the legacy just is a familiarity with the struggle for universal and equal rights. Now, part of the problem of seeing that is that there was not a demand for a democratic constitution in the civil rights movement or in the New Left. It just was not perceived. It just couldn't be comprehended, even though people could see the flaws in the political system and, the Senate, the control that the Dixiecrats had in Congress and the Senate. You can see little parts of it, but no one put it all together. And yet, underlying the civil rights movement was a notion of equal rights and the struggle for them. And there was a process of learning, of relearning history, and going back to Mills's thing of read Lenin and Luxembourg again. Well, what could that possibly have meant? Well, actually, that's what we're going through. That's what we've been going through for the last 50 years, trying to understand where the world is and where it's come from. And so the article, Marxism Is Democratic Republicanism. Well, Marxism just picked up the ideas of democracy and socialism that already existed, even before Marx and Engels were born. But before they even became adults, the Chartist movement and Owenism in England were really developed. And they learned a lot about what politics and capitalism was, from that. And so in every particular struggle is the universal idea of equal rights, and and so the civil rights movement was part of that development. And going back and reading King's stuff, his first book in 1958, I can't remember the title of it off my head, and then the second book in 67, Where Do We Go From Here? He really delves deeply into the meaning of democracy and equal rights. And like I said, the parallel with Marx and Engels and Luxemburg and Lenin and their commitment to democracy, they share a common heritage because it all comes from Tom Paine and the French Revolution. And we're just rediscovering now in the United States the inadequacy of this constitutional structure, the authoritarian nature of it from the beginning. And so in that sense, the legacy of the civil rights movement is the legacy of democracy and equal rights. And that struggle has been going on for 250 years. It's not nearly complete. And I think it's that historical realization, some sense of proportion of what the nature of modern history is, that can give us some idea of what we have to do going forward.
Well, I think that's certainly what we try to do in the reader I mentioned, Recovering the Struggle for Equal Rights and Democracy, which is to put the civil rights movement into that long struggle for equal rights and democracy, as you said, the long struggle that continues to move forward, and to see what was accomplished, to see what wasn't seen, as I like to put it, in terms of the structural denial of democracy at the constitutional level, and then to look at that through the new or developing lens that we have these days that is increasingly taking the Constitution into account. And folks like Aziz Rana have unpacked perhaps why that's easier or possible to do these days, and what were the challenges to having a constitutional critique in the 20th century during the Cold War, times of mass upheaval, so on and so forth. But that we can approach the civil rights movement, other historical events as well, through that lens of constitutional critique. Well, Gil, I really wanted to thank you for coming on today and talking with us. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close shop here?
So during the campaign in 2024, there was this question of, do you vote for the Democrats? Despite the genocide in Gaza. My whole framework of thinking is, if we need democracy, there's a party that calls itself democratic that is not democratic. And there's an ideological battle that we are going to have with the Democratic Party leadership over the meaning of democracy, the meaning of the Constitution, and what do you do about elections? Because of the electoral structure excluding, making it difficult for any kind of progressive, humane politics to get a foothold. And so, we see with the nomination of Mamdani in New York, how this plays out. Now, there are some people who say, oh, we're going to take over the Democratic Party or whatever. I happen to feel I mean, and you can see it with the Cuomo and the Democrats opposing Mamdani. The whole idea of vote blue no matter who doesn't apply to the leadership of the Democratic Party because they would much rather defeat the left. Their job is to defeat the left rather than the right. They'll accommodate themselves. They'll even accommodate themselves to Trump and even pave the way for the possibility of Republicans to do what they're doing. But they will unite against the left and blame the left for the Democratic Party's own losses. The question of how do you establish a truly democratic constitutional movement and how that carries out, I think, in conflict, because there is no unified thing called the Democratic Party. It's high government officials. It's the contributors, billionaire contributors. But then there's the mass of the people who are kind of for the Democratic Party rhetoric, who would actually want to see it enacted. So the one thing is how we're going to deal with that. Now, so my thing is, well, you have to seize the meaning of democracy and promote that and somehow push out the anti-democratic, the democratic in name only portions of whatever this thing called the Democratic Party is. So it's an ideological struggle, and it's going on, within Democratic primaries. Who knows where it's going to go, but that's where I think the ideological battle is.
Well, it's a good point, bringing in the Democratic Party. We've published various articles, the one you wrote and that you just mentioned, the Democratic Constitution Strategy is the blueprint for a new party. We also published an article recently by Lucas talking about David Hogg and some of the internal workings of the Democratic Party. I recently wrote something short on Elon Musk's attempt to start a new party to some extent, and just the various obstacles to party starting that exist in the US. But certainly when it comes to the civil rights movement, the Democratic Party embraces or attempts to embrace as much as that movement as possible. I saw just yesterday, I don't remember why, but a Democratic House member was talking about John Lewis, and whenever they do something that's against the rules, I think they walked out of a hearing yesterday, they think of John Lewis and kind of the anti-status quo disruption of the moving of the machine sort of nature of John Lewis. And then, of course, in August will be the 60th anniversary of the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and I'm sure the Democratic Party will have something to say about that. I think very much frame it as a matter of the nefarious Republicans trying to muddle with what's going on. The Republicans certainly are trying to take away as many voting rights as do exist. But as we've argued, it's not simply a matter of the bad Republicans versus the good Democrats. It's much more a question of the larger political structure that fundamentally denies universal and equal rights. So all that to say, again, looms the Democratic Party, who I think these days has very much tried to attach themselves to the legacy of the civil rights movement.
Yeah. The Black Agenda report, I think it was Bruce Dixon who came up with the term, called the Black Misleadership Class, where the Democratic Party did, try to pick off and integrate portions of the civil rights movement into the larger structure of the Democratic Party, and they did a very good job. Okay, but that neglected the needs of the mass of Black people and the rest of the country, and that there's just no compromise over the nature of the structure of this political system. it just has to be, thrown out, and so that's all I would say about the direction and the civil rights movement. It is for equal rights, and that includes the right to an equal vote. And the Democratic Party just won't touch it. And so anyway, it's also obvious, kind of what the task is. And I just think we have to be simple and straightforward about it.
I was just saying, thanks again for coming on, Gil. And as with all of our guests, continuing, or I should say, just beginning in many ways, the conversation. That's what I hope that folks who are listening to these episodes who aren't already familiar with the history get intrigued, follow up on what Gil and other guests say, follow the links that we share, read the articles, so on and so forth, read King's speeches, read what Lenin wrote about students being enlisted into the army, read what you've written, Gil, about your experience in SDS and the need for a democratic movement, for a democratic constitution, all the above.
Great. Nice being here.
All right. Take care.